So what are Czech politicians up to again? Ban social networks for young people. Ladies and gentlemen, let's take a look at it. Let's find out what the arguments for banning social networks are, what the arguments against banning social networks are, how it looks in other countries where some kind of ban or limitation on social networks already exists, and how we could get inspired and what we are actually going to do. Please write in the comments whether you are currently for or against the ban on social networks. We have already done a survey in our community section where over 1,000 people voted, mainly over 1,000 people who are part of my community, so people who think more or less liberally, pro-Western and pro-European, and over 70% of people said they would be in favor of a ban or some kind of restriction on children's access to social networks. I don't agree with that. However, let's talk about what this is really about, what's being planned, and let's use this as a starting point. The discussion is about whether access to social networks should be banned for children under 15 or whether it should be monitored, limited, and so on in some way. So far, there isn't any significant consensus yet. It was mainly outlined by Andrej Babiš and the Action of Dissatisfied Citizens movement. Their main argument is that instead of children playing sports or doing some useful activities, they are scrolling through brain rot, scrolling through TikTok, and being active on social networks, and they're not engaging in those healthy social interactions that lead to proper socialization and brain development. Which is absolutely true. To a certain extent, this is a problem. But the main argument is about the safety of children. Because there are various predators, pedophiles, and so on social networks. On the other hand, some people see it as too much of an invasion of privacy, whether for the children or their parents. But most of the population, just like most of the people who voted on my social network, are in favor. And maybe they don't even know what they're in favor of. Basically, they're not so much for a ban, but more for the state having the right to hassle parents because their children use social networks. It's being sold as, let's ban social networks for children to protect them from brain rot and predators. But in reality, it's supposed to mean, let's allow the state to hassle parents because their children are on the internet. So that's how it is. Okay, let's now take a look at what the arguments for the ban are. Don't ban social networks for young people, recommend experts from Masaryk University. They are against it. But the arguments for the ban are as follows. First of all, social networks are running a terribly unfair competition against us, not just against adults, but also against children. They have the best psychologists, psychiatrists, neuroscientists, and so on their side. And they optimize social network algorithms so that it works like gambling, like a drug. And all these experts on the human brain and psyche are optimizing those algorithms and going up against the undeveloped brains of small children who are scrolling through Facebook, TikTok, and Instagram from a really early age. This is very unhealthy and very addictive. And really, the competition is by no means, at no point, fair or balanced. That's the first thing. Secondly, there is a scientifically proven correlation, not causation, but correlation between people excessively using social media and spending time on social networks, and people, especially children, having mental health issues like increased anxiety or sleep disorders. Also, as I've already mentioned, social networks are places where children are very easily exposed to cyberbullying, and they can also encounter various sexual predators, pedophiles, and this kind of scum. So that's another thing. Social networks are not a safe place for children. Besides that, they also create a breeding ground for serious physical illnesses in children. Not only does the child sit hunched over scrolling through TikTok instead of moving and developing their muscles and motor skills, but children also often encounter very bad examples of how they should look there. Through various filters, different lighting, and different AI effects, for example, boys see a lot of muscular guys there. They don't see that these guys are on steroids, that they've achieved this after years of training, and that a large part of it is just lighting. No, boys see muscular guys, and so at 13 years old, they go to the gym and want to do deadlifts, which is, of course, harmful for their musculoskeletal system, right? And overall, it develops a sense of inferiority in them and leads to eating disorders or body image issues. Very unhealthy. It's exactly the same for girls. So that's another reason why being very active on social media and the presence of such young people on social media is personally harmful for them. At the same time, there's also the problem of scrolling itself. That excessive stimulation, which comes from brain rot or Moskosh rot, from those short videos that you keep swiping one after another, worsens children's concentration, distracts them from deeper information processing, develops attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and overall reduces people's ability to work cognitively. Basically, you could say that the arguments for banning social networks are mostly health and safety related, and you could say that for the same reasons we ban children from playing slot machines in casinos, gambling in general, drinking alcohol, smoking cigarettes, and so on. For those same reasons, we should also ban them from accessing social networks, because social networks are also dangerous for their mental as well as physical health. However, we need to pause here and say that just as cigarettes, alcohol, and gambling are bad for children, just like social networks, things like sugar, caffeine, energy drinks, and overheated fats are also bad for children. So where do we draw the line on what we still allow, what the state will still tolerate, and what the state will have the right to punish the parents for? In this regard, it would be quite interesting to say that parents really should supervise their children more on social networks, and if a child is not educated or brought up in how to behave on social networks and how often to use them, and if that child uses social networks excessively to the point where it causes psychological problems, anxiety, or develops an eating disorder, then this should be considered parental neglect. Just like when you catch kids completely drunk somewhere in a park or when they go to school with unbrushed teeth, etc., that is also treated as neglect. So these are the arguments for a ban. It's dangerous, it's unhealthy, it's harmful, and overall it messes up kids' brains. There are also arguments opposing the ban. The arguments against the ban are partly ideological and partly pragmatic. The first ban, or the first reason not to ban it, is that social networks are primarily a part of the modern world. And instead of a ban, it would be much more desirable to educate children. Educate them on how often to use social networks, raise them so they don't use social networks too often, so they don't have all the social networks. One is enough for them, and so on. And as I said, if a child wasn't educated like this, then there should be a certain attention from the school or the surroundings or even social services towards their parents and ask, hey, why does your child spend so much time on social networks? Why is their brain rotting? That's just wrong. So based on that, there should be some kind of requirement for this type of upbringing. It's not illegal, right? It's not illegal for a child to go to school with unbrushed teeth, dirty and in smelly clothes. That's not illegal, right? But it is illegal to neglect your child. And neglect should also include this kind of internet non-upbringing, for example. However, Regarding another argument against the ban, it's mainly true that social networks nowadays work as a way for a lot of kids to communicate with friends or make new friendships. It really works as a social tool. It's not just a box for drugs, but it's a social network. Therefore, if you ban it for them, you will significantly damage their connections with their peers. Then there's the practical part. How exactly do you want to ban it? Let's say you ban it and the kids won't be able to go there. Somehow you make it so they can't go there. What will the kids do? They'll find a way. Whether they log in there through a VPN, kids know how to do that, or they find some other social network that doesn't require these things and maybe works on the darknet. As a result, these kids, instead of being on some, let's say, normally functioning social network like Facebook, Instagram, or TikTok, will end up on some shady social network somewhere in the underworld that avoid these regulations, and they'll be more exposed to danger from predators, because those predators will know that if kids can't be on the normal social networks, they're hanging out somewhere else. By the way, that's also an argument against social networks just for kids, because these social networks that are only for children are like an enclosure where you let the kids in and let the predator pick and choose. So this is exactly the big danger, and as we discussed here, that social networks are dangerous because a predator can come across these kids. For this very reason, what we just talked about, banning them from social networks doesn't solve this problem. It actually makes it worse because you just drive them somewhere else. Besides that, there are also arguments that social networks are not just about entertainment, but they also serve for informal education, sharing information, and so on. When a teacher doesn't have time to explain something in class, many times the child uses social networks to learn it at home. For example, I used to do that by watching YouTube videos from Mathematicator to better understand math that I couldn't grasp at school. So these are arguments against the ban. They are mostly pragmatic, focusing on how you will do it and whether the ban will actually achieve its goal. And it seems that banning social networks won't achieve the goal that is actually the argument for the ban. So actually, the argument against the ban is that what we want to achieve by banning it won't be achieved by the ban. And I fully agree with that. And can we look at how it works abroad, for example? They've already tried it there. For example, in France. In France, the ban on social networks works in such a way that anyone, a child, an adult, anyone can be on social networks, but a child under 15 is not yet digitally of age, and a child under 15 therefore needs confirmation from their parents that they can be on social networks. Well, the truth is it doesn't really work. Kids get around it, they set up VPNs, they gather on online forums, in games, and so on. But there's one positive point, which is that parents, in theory, should approve their children's activity on social networks. This has significantly increased parents' interest in why social networks are harmful, how their child behaves on social networks, and so on. Because of this ban, which isn't really enforced and doesn't work very well, parents have become much more involved in their child's activities. They were reminded that they really need to address this, that there really is something to it. And as a result, the situation improved. In addition, France requires the social networks themselves to take responsibility and to monitor their own platforms to see if there are children active without parental approval. Yeah, but again, this doesn't really work. It's kind of a half-baked product, but its positive point was that parents were better informed that social networks can simply be harmful. Then we have the ban in Australia. There's a complete ban there. If you're under 16, you can't be on social networks at all, and social networks have to verify your age. The fact is, you have to enter your identification there. Parents are responsible, but of course, it doesn't work. Kids end up in a kind of gray area, getting around it using VPNs and so on. So whether it's in France or Australia, it hasn't really worked anywhere, and it definitely hasn't fully improved the situation or solved those problems. However, I think that here we shouldn't really aim to solve all the problems, and the argument for it shouldn't be that it's impossible to enforce or who will enforce it. That's completely pointless, because you could use the same argument against, for example, drunk driving. There you could also say, and who will enforce it if I get in my car drunk here in Horny Dolny and drive 5 kilometers to Dolny when there's no police around? Who will enforce that I'm not driving drunk? Well, no one, of course. But the ban itself, some kind of restriction, or the public debate that has now arisen just because the ban is even being discussed, this very thing will raise awareness among adults and really everyone that there is a problem here, that it's dangerous, that brain rot stinks, and so on. And it can have its positive effect. So we don't actually have to ban social networks. We should aim for a certain form of regulation of social networks and create a certain combination. Nothing will work 100%, but a combination of awareness, meaning some massive information campaign organized by the state involving influencers and so on the topic of mental health, internet hygiene, and so on. If we do this, if the state pays for it and promotes it, it will improve the situation to some extent. In addition, if we introduce at least some restrictions, not necessarily a ban, but for example, making access to social networks conditional on parental approval, so that parents have to be the intermediary between the child and access to social networks, it will involve parents more in what their child is doing. There will be more communication between the parent and the child based on what the child is doing on the network, how long they're there, whether they know it's wrong, and so on and so on and so on. Of course, you could argue that the child might, I don't know, steal their parents' identification and set it up themselves. Okay, based on that, there should be some kind of verification process on social networks. And that verification process could be through bank identity. So the child couldn't be on a social network without their parents' knowledge, because the parents would have to confirm that the child can access the social network and that they can be on it specifically through bank identity. And they could revoke this confirmation at any time, end it, and based on that, the child would no longer have access to the social network. The social network itself should have the obligation to check this under the threat of some kind of fine. But of course, this would eventually lead to greater regulation of social networks and, for example, to the point where everyone who is on or enters social networks would have to verify their identity as a citizen, either through bank identity or a data box. It doesn't matter. Of course, that would take away anonymity on social networks, but at the same time, it would also remove the possibility for various fake accounts to operate there and pollute the discussion, and so on. So, that's the thing. Overall, I don't see anything positive about anonymity on social networks, because anonymity on social networks is always mainly used for negative activities. I've never seen anyone anonymous on social networks do anything that isn't complete crap. It's always just criminal activity, trolling, harassment, or threats. No one from an anonymous profile has ever written to me and said, "Hey, I'm doing a charity event. I'm saving puppies, but I'm afraid someone might find out, so I have an anonymous account." No. People use that anonymity to do harm, which I think we really don't need, especially on social media. And if people are afraid that their banking identity would be misused by social networks, that they would take their personal data, for heaven's sake. Your activity on social media is far more valuable than where you were born, what your name is, and how old you are. No. What you click on, where you go, what you write there, what you post there, that's far more valuable than your citizen identity or banking identity. Besides, you've already given your personal information to the bank a long time ago. What's the difference between giving it to the bank and giving it to Facebook? Now, these corporations as corporations are governed by certain laws about how to handle personal data. That's how it is. This is my view. This is my view on social networks. Overall, I think that banning social networks for children under 15 will be counterproductive, that it won't bring the desired result. But a certain regulation of social networks based on which awareness of digital literacy would increase about how social networks work, how to behave on them, and let's say the transparency of who is actually on those social networks, who and whether some profile is fake, paid for by the Kremlin, or fake, paid for by Brussels, or if it's a real person, this would all be significantly increased and improved by that. And personally, I think that anonymity on social networks really doesn't have such value that we should put it above the safety of children or above the transparency of debate or above the public interest, for example, regarding the spread of certain opinions or the protection of the public. So that's it. Write me in the comments what you think about it, whether you are for or against the ban. And please also give some argument about why it would bother you if complete anonymity stopped existing on social networks. Thanks a lot and bye for now. Yeah, I'll just add that you could still be called Pepe Zedepa on the social network, but Facebook itself would have the information about who you really are. So others wouldn't know. You wouldn't have to use your real profile picture or your real name. That wouldn't be necessary, but the account would know who you are. It would be linked to that specific person, similar to how it works on, I don't know, Tinder or something like that. You also have to verify yourself there, right? Then, of course, there could also be a double system or even a triple system where you could see for each user whether it's verified that they're a real person or whether it's not verified. And based on the fact that it's not verified, you could say, aha, this person is probably a bot or, I don't know, maybe a child or something like that. There would already be some suspicion. It could be investigated. More attention could be focused on those who are not verified to monitor whether they're doing any illegal activities or whether they belong there and so on and so forth. Look, there are plenty of ways to do it right. A ban, a complete ban, isn't one of them. Yeah, that's how it is.